I was an exorcist in training. The plane ride to the Vatican was hell. For an hour, maybe two after I called the Vatican, I sat on the front steps of the house, staring into space. Father Felipe was nowhere to be seen. I figured that was for the best. He'd probably taken Father Anthony's advice and run back to his church. With any luck, he was sleeping. I sat shaking on the steps. I reeked of blood and worse. Of course, I thought through the horror I'd just witnessed. The thick air, the smell of exposed guts, the glee on Maya's face as she slurped up Father Anthony's intestines. But that wasn't what dominated my thoughts. I'd seen her, Sophia, just as clearly as if she were still alive, warm and sitting beside me, teaching me to sew. Without question, she had been there. She had saved me. And so, I must have made an odd sight when the priest sent by the Vatican arrived. I sat there covered in several people's blood, including my own, my fingers bleeding from my clumsy needlework, smiling like I'd just seen God himself. "So good to find you well, Father Matthew," said a tall, muscular priest with a thick gray beard. "I'm Father Thomas. This is my trainee, Father Anselmo." He gestured to a rail-thin bald man with angular features beside him. "I thought I knew all of the exorcists working in the States," I said, still half-dazed. He shook his head. "We are not ordinary exorcists," he explained. "We belong to a particular order where discretion is of utmost importance. Still, we know rumors of our existence circulate. Perhaps you've heard of the Knights of St. Michael?" I shook my head. "Good," he said. "We are only called upon in cases requiring certain non-traditional skills. Based on your call, the Vatican believes this may be one such case." Father Anselmo shot him a look, and I recognized it immediately. It was one I'd given Father Anthony a dozen times when we arrived at the home of some poor girl claiming to be possessed, but really just needed a few years of therapy. Maybe some antipsychotic meds. "What?" I asked. "You don't believe me? What I saw?" "We're certain you saw something," said Father Thomas. "Whether you performed a common exorcism or encountered something greater remains in question." "Look at my fucking clothes," I shouted, staggering to my feet. "Look at the blood on my hands. Smell me. Don't you smell it?" That's when I looked down at myself and realized I was clean. Not even a drop of blood decorated my robes. The only evidence of my encounter was a small scab on my index finger from where I'd pricked myself with the needle as I sewed Maya's mouth shut. I looked back at the house. Even the dark, smeared window was clean now, with a gentle light shining out. Without another word, I ran back up the steps and opened the door. Inside, the house was pristine, almost unnaturally so. The blood was gone. The stink, too. Somewhere, a vanilla candle was burning. Gentle music played on the speakers overhead. "The girl," I said to no one in particular, and now I was running up the stairs 2 at a time again. I ran down the hall and burst into her room, half expecting to find her hanging from the ceiling by her feet, a mass of skin and sinew hanging from her mouth. Instead, I found her lying still, almost deathlike in bed. She wore a spotless white dress, and her hair fell about her head on the pillow, as if perfectly arranged strand by strand. She was beautiful now, no longer the creature of paper and bones I'd encountered hours earlier. The only evidence that anything had happened was the silver thread still in place, sealing her mouth shut. I heard the other priests approaching from behind me. "None of this is right," I said. "None of it was this way." "I believe you," said Father Thomas, putting a hand on my shoulder. "We have seen stranger things. The devil can be exceptionally tidy when he chooses to be." "Or could it be that Father Matthew elected to perform a wholly unnecessary surgery?" said Father Anselmo, gesturing to the girl's lips. "We can pray that such is the case for her sake," said Father Thomas. "In the meantime, we will proceed as if this is a true lieutenant of hell, likely of the third circle." I gave him a look. There were no such things as circles of hell in the canon. "Gluttony?" asked Father Anselmo, incredulous. "I thought they were supposed to be fat." Father Thomas shook his head. "Remember your Aquinas," he said. "Gluttony takes 5 forms. Laut, too luxurious. Studios, too elaborate. Nimis, too large a quantity. Prepropere, eating at the wrong time. ardenter, eating too fast. A glutton may be any size. I could tell Father Anselmo wanted to argue, but he was the trainee after all, and it wasn't becoming to argue, especially in front of a stranger. He bit his tongue. "Very well then," said Father Thomas. "Then we shall proceed. Prepare bindings of cloth soaked in holy water. Wrap her once at the shoulders, once at the wrists, once at the ankles. Father Matthew, if you are feeling up to the task, another set of hands would be useful, especially since time can be a factor in some cases. We will want to get her back to the Vatican as soon as possible before—" As he spoke, I saw a hint of movement coming from the girl's direction. Glancing over, I saw something thick and black peek its head from between the two middle stitches of the mouth where the gap was greatest. It could have been a worm, a tongue, a snake, a centipede. Before I could get a good look, it pulled back inside. I helped Father Anselmo prepare the bindings, though I could tell he would have rather done the job himself. They'd brought holy water in some kind of red-brown earthenware jar that I hadn't seen before. We soaked 3 long strips of cloth and bound the girl, who didn't stir once. Though I had never heard of such a protocol before, the process made sense. 3 bindings representing the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit uniting to bind the demon. 2 hours later, we were on a private plane bound for Rome. The aircraft was luxurious by any standard, with plush white leather chairs emblazoned with the flaming sword of St. Michael, in delicate black embroidery. 2 pilots sat up front, through a security door that looked extra thick. They'd made a point of letting me know they were both well armed. Of course, I wondered why such levels of protection were necessary, but I just nodded as if this was all perfectly normal. "Enjoying the accommodations?" asked Father Anselmo. Father Thomas had drifted off at takeoff, snoring loudly. Maya lay nearby in a seat they'd reclined to dorm a bed. "Father Anthony and I flew coach if we flew at all," I said. "Usually we drove." He scoffed. "I suppose you think yourself superior because of your humility." "I never said any such thing," I said, but he was right. "You didn't need to," he said with a sneer. He cracked his knuckles, and then scratched furiously at the back of his head. "You only reveal your own ignorance. We, the Knights of St. Michael, are the very sword of God. One does not enter the battlefield on bended knee, supplicating to his opponent. He comes out in armor of gold, wielding a sword of fire, striking fear into the hearts of the demons." Now it was my turn to laugh. "So the leather seats? That's the modern-day equivalent of a flaming sword? I'm sure they terrify the devil." Father Anselmo stood and stretched. He itched at his scalp again, furiously. "I read about you on the way over," he said. "A convert. Widowed. You wear the robes, but you're different from those of us who grew up in the faith, who never knew a woman's touch." Before, I'd been slightly annoyed at Father Anselmo. Now, at the mention of my wife, I felt my blood rising. "God comes to us all at different times," I said quietly, but my hands were balled into fists. "Save it for the flock," he said. "We're all priests here. We should speak honestly. You and I, we're not the same." When my wife was in high school, she had a terrible boyfriend. He was an honor student and a top athlete, popular, beloved. No one would have suspected the pain he inflicted on her in private. Even when we started dating, 10 years later, she couldn't describe what he'd done to her physically, in the dark of night one summer alone in his family's cabin. No one for miles around, a fact he whispered to her over and over. All she would say is that a few days later, after praying the pain would go away on its own, that she'd driven herself to the doctor, who gave her stitches and promised not to tell her parents. Somehow, even after what he'd done, she couldn't break up with him. They continued dating through prom, even into the summer after senior year. She tried not to be alone with him, but it was futile. He hurt her again and again. When they finally broke up, there was no big confrontation. It was just the standard ending where they both went to college and drifted apart, eventually realizing they were no longer a couple. When they saw each other on holiday breaks, they acted friendly, even though his presence was enough to send her into a panic. After hearing the story, it occurred to me that I might have a moral obligation to find this man and hurt him as badly as he'd hurt her. maybe to kill him. Partly to spare any future women he might date from a similar fate. But if I'm being honest, it was mostly pure revenge. Naturally, Sophia was utterly opposed. Maybe she wanted to protect me from the consequences of such a thing. More likely, she knew I wouldn't have a chance against him. He'd been an all-state wrestler and outweighed me by 20 pounds. Eventually, we came to a kind of agreement. I wouldn't seek the man out, but if I ever happened to bump into him, I was allowed to do whatever I wanted. For many years, whenever we visited her hometown, I felt a surge of adrenaline any time a man matching his description walked in the door of a restaurant. "Is that him?" I'd ask, and she'd shake her head. No. Gradually, we visited Sophia's hometown less often. I never did see the man in person. As far as I know, I'd still have her permission to kill him if I ever bumped into him. "You're right," I told Anselmo after a moment. "We're not the same. And since we're going to be honest, maybe you'd be a better priest if you'd had a couple of rolls in the hay before you put on your collar, even just to know us sinners a little better." He was scratching harder than ever at the back of his head now. "We're not the same!" he was shouting now, so loud that Father Thomas began to stir in his seat. "You didn't deserve to capture a lieutenant of hell. You got lucky. You weren't even properly trained. You just finished one last stitch. You're not even a real priest." He practically roared the last word. It had a strange echo, like it had been harmonized by two voices at once. As he spoke, he tore at the back of his skull again, and this time I heard a ripping sound, like flesh unzipping in two. Blood began to accumulate on his shoulders. "Father Anselmo," said Father Thomas quietly, fully awake now. "Please step to the side of the plane. Kneel. Fold your hands in prayer." "I'll do no such thing, you meat-headed fuck," shouted Anselmo. It was clear that two voices were speaking in unison now, his and another deeper one emanating from the back of his skull. Suddenly, without warning, two things happened. Father Thomas began to say a Hail Mary in the original Latin, so fast that the words flowed together in a steady hum. Second, he pelted Father Anselmo with a jar of holy water that exploded as it collided with his chest, sending fragments of pottery and liquid everywhere. "Behind me," he shouted between recitations. I stepped back. As I did, the plane shook, and I nearly fell. The sky had been cloudless when we took off from LA. Now, dark thunderheads had gathered outside, blotting out the sun and pelting the small windows with rain. Father Anselmo had taken a step back after absorbing the force of the water jar. He also turned 180 degrees, revealing his back to us. There, I saw a bloody face no bigger than a baby's skull protruding just above where his neck met his hairline. The baby's contorted mouth shouted every syllable as Father Anselmo screamed, "There's nowhere to run to, priest. You're trapped up here with me now. This time, you're mine." "Bifron's the two-faced," said Father Thomas. "I thought I recognized your—" Before he could say another word, Father Anselmo Bifrons now charged at him. I realized that in addition to the tiny head, he'd sprouted an extra set of arms and legs, which extended from his elbows and knees and had now grown almost as large as the original ones. The fresh limbs were bare and bloody, glossed with a sheen of mucus like a newborn baby. Bifrons fell on Father Thomas with his full weight, beating at him with the bloody limbs and biting at his face with his fast-growing new heed. But Father Thomas had been prepared. Pushing Anselmo to the side with one hand, he took a small silver blade in the other and stabbed it to the hilt into the baby head's right eye. The baby screamed a low growl that seemed to shake the very air inside the plane, and the aircraft dipped again, this time by 100 feet or more, tossing us all off our feet. When I looked back at Father Thomas, his forehead was bleeding from falling against the edge of a chair. Ignoring the injury, he dug into his bag and removed 3 more knives. "Demon of greed," he said, gesturing to the demon. "Bifrons. We can contain him if we seal all 4 eyes. Try to stay back. Let me work." Even as he said it, though, I could see him wobbling on his feet. He touched his forehead, and the blood was gushing now. "Bad luck, Father Thomas," said Bifrons. "I suspect our next little conversation will be in my place." He charged at Father Thomas again, but the priest was ready. Deftly, he stabbed 2 knives into the eyes that had once been Anselmo's. The demon howled in pain, so loud that my ears began to ring, and I fell to my knees. Outside, The clouds had fully blotted out the sun. Everything seemed to be shaking. I wondered if we were falling into the deep black sea. Thomas fell back now, his head hitting the ground with an unpleasant crack. He didn't open his eyes. Across the plain, the demon rose, fixing me in its one remaining eye. The lights shorted in the plain, and the engines went silent. Everything was black, save for the occasional flash of lightning. It seemed to me that I was about to die, or that perhaps I already had. Perhaps the rest of my existence would be like this, surrounded by darkness with the constant feeling of falling, a demon laughing a few feet away. Of course, fear gnawed at me, like a family of mice nibbling at my guts. But could I be blamed? Wouldn't anyone be afraid in such a moment? "Bad luck for you both," said the thing. "At least you'll finally be able to visit your dear wife again. Sophia, isn't it? I hear she's been missing you greatly." At the mention of Sophia's name, reality snapped back to focus. It was as if the plane was holding in mid-air. Gravity felt somehow lighter. I got to my feet, my fear replaced with simple, blind rage. Suddenly, the thing in front of me wasn't Bifron. It was Sophia's ex. I reached forward and uncurled the final blade from Father Thomas's limp, bloody fingers. "I told you not to talk about my wife," I said. I could feel her there with me again. Silently, I asked if our deal was still on, if I could still kill him. I can't be sure, but I think I heard her whisper, yes. Now it was my turn to charge forward. My vision narrowed. Through the darkness, all I saw was the one, cruel, white eye staring at me. I thought of my wife. Then I drove the blade home. On the tarmac in Rome, a man with red robes was waiting for us. I recognized him from a pamphlet I'd once read as Cardinal Robles. He reacted little as he surveyed the bloody scene. The pilot still hadn't left the cockpit. I suspected it was some sort of protocol. Father Tomas lay in my lap, his head bound with a pillowcase I'd fashioned into a makeshift bandage. Both Maya and Anselmo's bodies lay peacefully on the floor, her mouth sealed with thread, his eyes with daggers. After a moment, the cardinal began to laugh. "You'll have to forgive me, Father Matthew," he said. "It's not often that I send my men out to capture one demon, and they come back with two." I coughed up a bit of blood. I wondered when I'd been injured. I didn't feel like laughing. "Enough," he said. "I think we'd better get these two back home before a third one shows up. What do you say?" I nodded weakly. "We'll get these two to their new accommodations, and then we're going to have a nice long chat," said the cardinal. "I'm starting to think that St. Michael has big plans for you."